right, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to EPA's Cumulative Risk Assessment 2013 webinar series. This webinar series is co-sponsored by EPA's Risk Assessment Forum, Cumulative Risk Assessment Technical Panel, and EPA's National Center for Environmental Research. We are happy that you are all able to join us today, and we are very pleased that we continue to have really high response to these webinars. My name is Devin Payne-Sturgis with EPA's National Center for Environmental Research, and I'm also the Assistant Center Director here for Human Health. And also with me on the line is my colleague, Audrey Galizia, and she will be giving introductory remarks regarding the work of the Risk Assessment Forum. And we're also very honored to have with us today two presenters on GIS application to cumulative risk assessment. We have David Degenian and Nick DeLuzio. And to accommodate our two speakers today, we have extended the time for the webinar to 4:30. The first part of the webinar will last about 50 minutes, and once David and Nick have presented, we will have approximately 30 minutes for questions and answers and discussion. And since there are many participants on the phone, and in order to ensure a successful webinar, all lines have been muted to minimize background noise. And also I'm going to ask my colleague Ashley to go over the ground rules.
While all lines have been centrally muted to reduce background noise, please also use the mute button on your phone if possible to avoid background noise, which can make it difficult for other participants to hear. If your phone does not have a mute button, it can be muted through the computer using the microphone button next to your name on the participants list in WebEx. Please note that muting using the WebEx participants list should only be necessary if you have accidentally clicked on your name in the WebEx participants box. All questions will be submitted using the chat feature in WebEx. These will be compiled and the presenter will address as many as possible following their presentation. To access the participants list and the chat feature in WebEx, please click on the green tab at the top of your screen. This will expand the box and you can click on Chat or Participants, and a box will appear on the right-hand side of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the EPA NSER website.
Thank you, Ashley. Before we get started, Audrey and I would like to say a few words about the purpose of these webinars. The purpose of the series is to share and discuss the progress of groundbreaking research on cumulative risk and other related activities, to develop and apply methods for assessing the combined health and or ecological risks of multiple chemical, physical, and or biological stressors with consideration of population vulnerability. The series will feature scientists from both inside and outside EPA. Assessing or evaluating the true reality of environmental impacts on human health is a major challenge for EPA. From my perspective, there is no one approach to cumulative risk assessment. There is a spectrum. And our purpose with each webinar is to explore an aspect of cumulative along that spectrum. Last month, we had two presentations on the use of epidemiological data for environmental decision-making in the context of cumulative risk and policy implications of cumulative risk assessment information. And this was also informed by a discussion around the recommendations to EPA from the national academies in their report, Science and Decisions. Today's presentation will be on the development and application of a GIS tool to evaluate multiple environmental hazards and overlay that information with information on community demographics. So now I'd like to turn to Audrey, who will say a few words about the Risk Assessment Forum's efforts on cumulative risk and how today's webinar will help address important issues for the RAS efforts. Audrey?
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Devin. The EPA has been engaged for a number of years in the development of guidelines for cumulative risk assessment through the leadership of the Risk Assessment Forum. The Risk Assessment Forum in the Office of the Science Advisor is an appointed committee of senior EPA scientists who develop agency-wide consensus on risk assessment issues and risk assessment guidance by establishing technical panels to undertake substantial initiatives such as cumulative risk assessment. A cross-agency risk assessment forum technical panel for cumulative risk assessment has been established, and the list of the members is shown in the next slide, I believe. There's a little bit of a delay with these slides, so please excuse us. And this technical panel is responsible for the development of cumulative risk guidelines. The technical panel first published the Cumulative Risk Assessment Framework in 2003, which can be accessed through the link at the bottom of the slide, the previous slide, I believe. The Risk Assessment Forum is very happy to partner with NSER to present webinars of current and cutting-edge thinking on cumulative risk. These webinars are intended to inform both the technical panel as well as the wider scientific community. The technical panels are listening to the webinar speakers and will engage in a dialogue following the speaker's presentation to get insights on the current and proposed cumulative risk methods and applications. A thoughtful, iterative approach to cumulative risk can result in the acquisition of relevant information. It can inform stakeholders, and it can support risk management decisions. Our speakers today will show how using relevant information such as pollution points and demographic data characteristics can inform stakeholders and can be useful as a tool to engage decision-making. We look forward to hearing from our speakers, and we welcome them. Now back to Devin, who will more formally introduce our speakers.
Well, thank you, Audrey. Yes, I would now like to introduce David Degenian and Nick DeLuzio, our 7th and 8th speakers for our series. David and Nick's presentation is entitled The Patterns of Pollution, Perspectives from an Environmental Attorney and a GIS Scientist on the Identification and Assessment of Environmental Justice Communities. David Degenian is a visiting assistant professor of law at Barry University School of Law in Florida and directs the law school's Environmental and Earth Law Clinic. David's work focuses in part on the development of laws and policies for the protection of environmental justice communities. Nick DeLuzio is a GIS analyst and project manager at Newfields, an environmental and environmental sustainability consulting firm in Atlanta, Georgia. Nick's expertise is in data management, geographic information systems, forestry, environmental management, and has provided him the opportunity to contribute to diverse projects ranging from contaminant distribution to environmental justice issues. So my understanding is that David will speak first, and so I'm going to turn it over to David.
This afternoon, Nick and I will be discussing the Patterns of Pollution Report, an environmental justice study that I co-authored with Justine Thompson last year while an attorney at Greenlaw, a nonprofit environmental law firm in Atlanta. As the title states, the Patterns of Pollution is a report on demographics and pollution in Metro Atlanta. And the report relies largely on GIS, or Geographic Information Systems analysis, which we'll be discussing in detail today. And here I have an outline of our presentation. I'll begin by starting with the goals that we had in mind when we began work on the report. And although I was the principal author of the report, Nick and his colleagues at Newfields designed the methodology for the study, and he'll take over and provide a description of the methodology that he developed in order to identify and analyze environmental justice communities. I'll then discuss the results outlined in our report, and finally I'll discuss the responses that we received, both positive and negative, in response to the report. Before I discuss our goals, I'll give you a bit of background on the report's conception. In 2010, I was lucky enough to secure funding from the University of Georgia School of Law for a 2-year fellowship at Greenlaw to create a public interest project that would provide legal resources to communities in need. With the funding, I created the Metro Atlanta Environmental Justice Project. And much of my work during the fellowship involved public education on environmental justice problems in the area and providing legal advice and representation to environmental justice communities. So when I started the fellowship, I was going out and listening in on community meetings and speaking with leaders who were doing environmental justice work, and I might get a call from someone saying that they had an environmental justice issue, and I would look at it from a legal perspective. But after about 6 months of working piecemeal like that in such a large area as Metro Atlanta, I decided that I could have a broader impact if I could find a logical way to locate environmental justice communities and then determine how they differed from other communities in terms of both demographics and the types of pollution that they were living in closer proximity to. So with that idea in mind, we were lucky enough to get free technical assistance from Newfields to begin the project of mapping out where environmental justice communities are and trying to prioritize those communities in terms of how I would go about providing legal assistance. So I'll start with giving a bit of a broader description of the goals of the study. And I've separated them out into micro goals and macro goals. And by micro goals, I mean what we actually intended to uncover in the study, and by macro goals, I mean what I hoped we would be able to accomplish once we had completed the study and made it available to a broad audience. So with the micro goals, first we wanted to develop an objective methodology for the identification and ranking of environmental justice communities. This was to allow me to clearly identify the communities for my own work so I could determine where is it that environmental justice communities exist in Metro Atlanta. There really isn't a system to make that identification. You can speak to people certainly in the area to find out where environmental justice areas are, but there wasn't sort of an objective way to look at a map and find out where these communities are. Second, we intended to evaluate the correlation between community demographic characteristics and the proximity to pollution points, meaning that we wanted to know whether certain demographics, such as race, language, and income of a community were predictors of the number of pollution points or sources of pollution within that community's area. And then lastly, it was important for us to create a user-friendly environmental justice mapping system for residents. We didn't just want the study to be something that would be used from a legal perspective or from a scientific perspective, but also something that could be easily accessible. The macro goals of the project were those that I had proposed initially to the University of Georgia when I sought funding for our environmental justice project. I wanted to educate the public on environmental justice problems, so raise awareness about the issue generally and also awareness amongst people who are living in environmental justice communities, to generate support for environmental justice laws and policies at state and local levels, and to assess the potential for legal advocacy and representation in identified environmental justice communities. Georgia's Environmental Protection Agency, EPD, the Environmental Protection Division, does not have an environmental justice policy or law, so meaning that it has no mechanism in place that we're aware of to consider environmental justice in permitting, which, as you can imagine, makes it difficult for me as an environmental justice attorney. There's really no avenue for us to bring up the issue of environmental justice when we're looking at the legal challenges to a permit or looking at a wide array of pollution problems that exist in this community. So the idea was maybe by putting this on a map and showing inequities, we could draw more attention to the need for those types of laws and policies. With that, I will pass it over to Nick to cover the methodology for the report.
Great. So in terms of methodology, I'm going to start out with a description of our study area. We looked at 14 counties that make up the Metro Atlanta area, and this is kind of where we focus our county. And you can see, since I realize not everybody is from the great state of Georgia or the even better city of Atlanta on this call, you can see on the bottom right corner gives you an idea of where we are and what areas we were looking at. And then we used 8 pollution data sets and 7 demographic data sets in our analysis. And at its most basic, our analysis is looking at the interaction between these 2 data sets. So on the left-hand side, you can see our pollution data that we used. These are all publicly available sources, most of which are from the EPA. A couple we obtained from Georgia EPD. And they include points of facilities that are permitted air pollution facilities, or they have NIPDES permits, or they're part of the Toxic Release Inventory Program or their surplus sites. And then on the right side, you'll see the demographic data that we use. We use 7 different demographic characteristics. All of this was obtained from either census data or the American Community Survey data set. And one of the things I want to emphasize here before I move forward is that while we focus our study on the Metro Atlanta area, our methodology and the model that we develop can be replicated in any area. So it can be any city, any state, even on a country level. All of this data is publicly available, so all it would take is compiling this data and then replicating the model, and somebody in Portland, Oregon could do the exact same thing that we did here in Atlanta. In the first step of the model, we have these 2 different types of data sets. And the data sets are in multiple data types, and they're in different spatial scales. And what I mean by that is if you look at the pollution points on the left, all of these 8 variables that we use, they're points. Each point represents a facility. And if you look at the demographic data on the right, the data that we obtained is on the census tract level. And as a subset of that, most of the data is in percentages in terms of its units, whereas 2 of the other data sets, the mean housing value and median family income, are given in terms of dollars. So we had to develop a model that would normalize these 2 different data sets in terms of data type and spatial scale, so that rather than trying to compare apples to oranges, we can get it so that we can compare apples to apples and find exactly where the pollution sources and our demographic data, where that overlay exists. So to tackle the spatial scale issue, we developed a study grid that we overlaid over our entire study area. And we made a 10 square kilometer grid, so each of the grid cells that you'll see is 10 square kilometers. And we joined our pollution data and our demographic data to this grid to get it onto a common spatial scale. And we looked at a couple different options for doing this, and we decided that creating this study grid gave us a finer resolution than census blocks did. And we looked at using some other political boundaries, but one of the problems with using an existing political boundary is that a lot of those boundaries are created already on demographics. So we wanted a resolution that will give us, or a grid that will give us the resolution that we wanted, and also eliminate as much bias as possible. So that's how we settled on creating this grid overlay. Now I'm going to walk you through kind of the model and our process to give you hopefully a visual idea and understanding of what we did. So in the map that you'll see on your left, with a bunch of black points, each point represents an air-emitting facility. So you can think of it as a factory or a manufacturing plant or anything that has an air emission permit. And the first step, what we did was we took these points, and within the GIS software, we overlaid our study grid on top and had the software sum up the number of points that were within each 10 square kilometer block. So the map that you see on the right, the green and red color-coded map, that shows the total number of air emission facilities within each block. And so it ranged from, most of the blocks, those that you see in green, had 0 facilities. And the blocks in red had between 11 and 25 air emitting facilities within a 10 square kilometer area. And what I hope that you can notice in this map is if you look at the distribution of the black points on the left and the distribution of the reds, oranges, and yellows on the right, they follow the same pattern. And that's what we're getting at. So we repeated this process for all 8 pollution data sets. So we ended up with 8 layers that look like the one on the right, where all they are is a simple sum of the points within each block. And we took those 8 layers and summed them all together. And that gave us what we're calling our pollution score. So what you're looking at now is each block has a value ranging from 0 to 55. And this represents the total number of pollution points from all of our 8 different variables that we looked at within a single 10-kilometer block. So the green blocks that you see kind of on the periphery of our study area, those blocks don't have any pollution points with them. And on the opposite side of that, our highest block had 55 pollution points within a 10 square kilometer area. So this is the first part. This is pollution data. From there, we had to tackle demographic data. And what you'll see, the map on the left shows the percent non-white population for our study area on the census tract level. We took the demographic data, and the first step was to break it out into quantiles. And what that means is we separate the data out into 5 categories, or 5 quantiles, whereas each quantile represents 20% of the distribution for that variable. And we then rescaled or reclassified the data based on those quantiles. And so what you'll see in the map on the left is the original census data as we obtained it. And the map on the right is that same data, we just rescaled it on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 represents, in this case, the communities that are predominantly white areas, and the 5, or the pinks, represent communities that are predominantly non-white. And again, as with pollution, we did this for all 7 demographic variables that we used, all based on this idea of the quantile. Then we took those 7 reclassified layers and we summed those up, and that gave us a total demographic score. Since we had the demographic score could range from a minimum of 8 to a maximum of 35. So areas with 8, or the light blue, those are going to be areas that are predominantly white. They have high income, high school graduation rates, and very low poverty levels, and they predominantly speak English. Whereas the areas that are in the top quantile, or those pink areas that you'll see, those are areas that are primarily non-white communities. Oftentimes they're low income. There's a lot of people living below the poverty line. English may not be the first language that they speak. So this kind of gives an idea of the demographics in the area. And now the final step is to look at the overlay, or the interplay between our pollution score that we developed and our demographic score that we developed. And so you'll see the map on the left is the pollution score, and the map on the right is the demographic score. And the final step of our model was to isolate those 10 square kilometer blocks that are in the top quantile for pollution, so those that are red, and in the top quantile for demographics, or those that are pink. And those are areas that we're calling environmental justice hotspots. So in this final map, this shows the final model output. And these are the blocks that ranked in the top quantile for pollution and the top quantile for demographics, meaning these blocks have a lot of pollution points, and they also have kind of at-risk demographics. And we came out with 55 blocks that we're calling environmental justice hotspots. But from here, we'll switch back to David, and he'll get into some more of our results and findings.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So Nick's gone over the methodology, which is the hard part, and I'll go over the results of our study. As Nick stated, we analyzed 7 demographic characteristics across the region. Of the 7, 4 revealed a direct correlation to pollution points. And When I talk about direct correlation for our purposes today, I mean that as the level of the demographic characteristic analyzed rises, so too does the number of the average number of pollution points. And when I speak of an indirect correlation, I mean that there's an inverse relationship between the two values. So when pollution points decrease, the demographic characteristic levels rise or increase. And the four characteristics in order of the strength of their correlation with pollution points in the region that we studied were race was the first, meaning the percentage of the population in the block that's non-white. Second, linguistic isolation, meaning the percentage of households in the block where no one over the age of 14 speaks English fluently. Third was poverty levels, and fourth was vacant housing levels. So I've got charts for each one of these, all 7 of the demographic characteristics that we looked at. And the first that you're going to see is the sort of correlation between pollution points and race or non-white population. As the slide shows, there's a direct relationship between the number of pollution points in a block and the percentage of the population in the block that's non-white. So on your left, you're seeing the average number of pollution points in the block, and then on the bottom here, you're seeing the racial makeup of the block. So in blocks that have, on average, less than 25% of the population is non-white, you're seeing a little under 2 pollution points per block, and then further along, when you're looking at communities that have over 50% non-white population, you're seeing on average their pollution points are a little over 4 on average. The second strongest correlation we found was between pollution points and linguistic isolation rates. Pollution point numbers are significantly higher in areas with a large number of residents who are unable to speak English fluently. If you look at the blocks that have where less than 5% of residents are linguistically isolated, you see on average they have just under 2 pollution points in their block. You can compare this with blocks where the linguistic isolation rates are over 20%, and you see about 5 pollution points on average in the block. And this was an interesting finding to me, as I hadn't necessarily thought of environmental justice in terms of linguistic isolation, and that brings up questions of the types of notices that are sent out to these communities when new pollution sources are being cited, and how we as attorneys are communicating with the communities. Next, you'll see that poverty rates also rise with the average number of pollution points. Blocks with poverty levels above 20% contain on average almost 6 pollution points. And you can compare that to blocks with poverty rates under 5% that have only 2 pollution points on average. In Metro Atlanta, our vacant housing rate, at least as of the census in 2010, was 9.4%. And our study showed a clear correlation between vacant housing rates and pollution points. And this is particularly true in any blocks with a vacant housing rate above 15%, where there are about 7 pollution points in close proximity on average. In contrast, you'll see that housing values were not predictive of pollution points in the region. In fact, areas with the highest housing values have on average slightly more pollution points than those valued over $100,000, and almost 3 times more than those home values below $100,000. And we haven't done any further study of this correlation, but my belief, at least based on my familiarity with the region, I think that Nick agrees on this too, is that there are more pollution points in higher income areas because, or higher housing value areas, because the region's population is centered around downtown and central Atlanta, where housing values are higher than in most areas in the region. There's an inverse relationship between pollution points and education levels, at least in terms of high school graduation rates. As high school graduation rates in the region increase, the number of nearby pollution points decrease. So you can see here that populations with graduation rates under 65% have almost twice as many pollution points on average as do others. And finally, there's a strong inverse relationship between pollution points and family income. Blocks with an average family income below $25,000 have on average a very high number of pollution points. We had to actually make this graph kind of with a different illustration because the number was at 15 pollution points per block when you're looking at family incomes at that level. And if you look at blocks with family incomes over $25,000, they have significantly less pollution points on average. So those are the 7 demographic characteristics that we looked at. Let's just step back and look at the pollution scores across the region. And Nick talked about this. This is just summing up the number of pollution points in each of the blocks. On the left, you're looking at high pollution blocks in the area. Those are in red, with 105 of the 1,282 blocks in the region identified as these high pollution blocks. And that means that they're in the upper quintile, or 1/5 of blocks, in terms of the number of pollution points. They each have 9 or more pollution points, and you can see, if you're at all familiar with the region, that they're largely centered around the downtown Atlanta area and central and western Fulton County. And we don't have the image here, but if you overlay a map of the region's railroads over the high pollution map, you'll see that the railroads run through many of the high pollution blocks, and it's an interesting way to look at the map. But we had difficulty actually quantifying the distance of a railroad to the pollution point, so we didn't include that in our report. On the right side of the slide, you'll see low pollution blocks in green, with 741 of the blocks identified as low pollution blocks. And these green blocks have no pollution points within their boundaries and are largely found in the outer rings of the region. And they represent mostly suburban and in some cases rural areas. So I think it's interesting to look at the sort of demographics of the low pollution and high pollution blocks. On the top you see low pollution blocks, which again are blocks that didn't have any pollution points. Their, on average, non-white population is 25.4%. High pollution blocks with 9 or more pollution sources within the block had on average a non-white population of 44.2%. And you can compare that with the regional average of 31.9%. And the racial composition of these blocks tells us that the blocks with the most pollution, at least in this region, have almost twice as many minorities as do those with no pollution points. And this last map shows you the environmental justice hotspots that Nick mentioned. The blocks are shown here in red, and they make up about 4% of the blocks total in Metro Atlanta, so 52 out of almost 1,300 blocks are identified here as what we call EJ hotspots. And the blocks were identified as being in the highest quintile for both demographics and pollution points, meaning that they had at least 9 pollution points and had the highest regional demographic scores. The hotspots are ranked by their combined pollution and demographic scores from 1 to 52. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the top 3 hotspots that we identified. But it was useful for us to be able to prioritize these areas, both in terms of drawing attention to leaders in the community and to the communities themselves, but also for my own work in order to sort of create a map of legal advocacy and representation. We've also included the location of something we call environmental justice cold spots in the region. Not the best name, but it was something that we settled on. The blocks are colored blue here and represent blocks in the upper quintile for pollution points, but they're in the lowest quintile for demographic scores, meaning that these are areas with a relatively high number of pollution points, but also their populations are mostly white, and they have positive economic characteristics like housing values and income and things like that. And there are 10 environmental justice cold spot blocks, and you can compare that with 52 of the hot spot blocks. So theoretically, if all residents were impacted by pollution equally, hot spots and cold spots would exist in the same frequency. However, they didn't in our study, so that was an interesting finding, and I think that was useful for sort of getting the point across about environmental justice for us. And I know that most people on the call probably aren't familiar with the region, but let me just take a couple minutes to go over the top 3 environmental justice hotspots that we identified before I talk about the responses and how we were able to use the study. I think that the top 3 environmental justice hotspots reveal kind of the diversity of the of the environmental justice hotspots identified in terms of geography, where they were placed across the region, demographics, and pollution. And they also show how our choice of methodology actually affected the results. The #1 environmental justice hotspot is located right here at the intersection of these 3 counties, Fulton, Douglas, and Cobb. And this is one of the Southeast's largest warehousing and transportation centers, and it's along a street called Fulton Industrial Boulevard. What you're looking at now is a sort of aerial view of this block that we've identified as the #1 environmental justice hotspot block. Demographically, the block's population is, if you look down, you can see at the bottom of the map, you can see the pollution point makeup and the demographic makeup. Demographically, the block's population is 86% non-white, and probably about 80% of those residents are African American, and vacant housing rates are over 20%. The block had the single most pollution points in the region with 55, 19 of which were air pollution sites, and 27 were reported violations. And I'll say that the violations that we included in the report are only ones that we consider to be substantive. There are no technical violations, and they're violations from 2008 to 2011, which are the ones that are reported in EPA's ECHO database. I think this area might be what some would consider to be the prototypical environmental justice community location. It's an industrial area, historically industrial, with a high minority and low income population, the large minority of which are African American. Our second hotspot was located in the northern portion of the region, and it's very different from the first hotspot, both demographically and from a pollution perspective. The population of this block is largely white, and it's not the location of intense industrial activity by any means. The identified block has a high school graduation rate below 65%, linguistic isolation rates at 21%, and more than a quarter of the population lives below the poverty line. Interestingly, there's only a single pollution point in the block, and that was the City of Canton's water pollution control plant. But the reason why this block showed up as being in the top of the environmental justice hotspot list is because it had a series of violations, 49 violations between 2008 and 2011. So you can see how the methodology affected the selection of the environmental justice hotspots. And this is an area that you might not think of as an environmental justice community because the population is or at least a significant portion of the population is white, but it opens up a conversation about looking at some of the other demographic characteristics and looking at whether facilities are complying with their environmental permits. And the last hotspot I will discuss is located in the central part of the region, and this area is along an area called Beaufort Highway, which is known to anybody who lives in that area as kind of a diverse ethnic population of Hispanic and Asian residents. Here you're looking at another aerial map of the environmental justice hotspots. This block scored 36 pollution points, and it was a mix of air pollution sites, violations, and toxic release inventory, or TRI sites, including the release of a combined total of 8,921 pounds of hazardous chemicals in 2010. What you're looking at here are the TRI releases over a 3-year period. Demographically, the area is made up largely of Asian and Hispanic residents. 45% of residents in the block are linguistically isolated. High school graduation rates are below 70%, and more than 26% of the population lives in poverty. And this might be, what we might categorize as a sort of the 21st century environmental justice hotspot. This is made up of Hispanic and Asian first and second generation immigrants and who have moved into what is a sort of industrial area. So it was an area that I had not been focused on in my work, and that we hadn't really been the subject of any discussion that I had seen when speaking with people who worked in the environmental justice area. So those are the results in our report, and before I get into the responses, I just want to draw you to a link that you can click on. I'm not going to go through and click on it here, but it's an environmental justice mapper that we designed in conjunction with the report. And the site was unveiled at the time of the report's release, and it allows anyone to visit the site and type in an address in the region for a report on the demographics and pollution in the area. So you could click on it, go to the site, type in an address, or you can just type in a name. So you can type in Georgia State University, which is my law school alma mater, and you get a PDF that provides the demographic characteristics of your census block and also a list of pollution points within a 3-mile radius. And it also gives you, it'll give you a rating as far as where your pollution score fits across the region. So you might fall into the red zone or into the green zone if if there aren't a lot of pollution points in your area. And the idea behind it is that it makes our data more accessible to people who might not otherwise take time to read the report. You can just go on there, click on it, and find out more about what's near you. And it's an easy tool for anybody who wants an easy interface for viewing both pollution points and demographics. And I found it to be very useful for presenting to local communities and to political leaders because I could tailor it to that specific community or that specific district and say, if you look here, you can see that this is the demographic picture and this is the pollution picture, and let's compare this to other parts of the region. Nick told me when we were sort of discussing the report that the site has had 1,600 hits since we unveiled it about 11 months ago. So it's getting a decent amount of traffic, and people are looking at it, and hopefully it's a useful tool. Lastly, I'm going to discuss the responses that we received after releasing the report. We intentionally released the report as visibly and widely as we could. We sent it via email to any environmental justice advocates, to political leaders, to people in the media, and we got a pretty strong response, at least from the media. It received news coverage on local television news, public radio, and various local newspapers and blog sites. So, goal number one of the sort of macro goals was bring attention around to environmental justice issues, and I think it did that successfully, at least for our purposes. We saw the report's results as an opportunity to make recommendations to at least begin to address the inequalities identified. So we've shown you a map of some of the EJ problems that we have. Let's take this opportunity to direct recommendations to targeted communities or targeted audiences to see if there's the potential to at least get the conversation going and make some changes in regard to disproportionate impacts. First, we recommended that environmental justice activists align and meet regularly in order to identify and address a strategy for shared goals. So, there wasn't, at the time that we released this report, any kind of group that was actively working together on environmental justice goals. So Greenlaw, I'm no longer there, but their environmental justice attorney has started that process, and I think they're having their first meeting in March. Next, we recommended that a regional working group be formed made up of business and government leaders to work collaboratively on developing ways for environmental justice issues to be incorporated into decision making. So is there a way that people who are working in business or in government can have a conversation about ways that environmental justice can become part of the sustainability conversation? Can private organizations or private industries develop a policy, an environmental justice policy that they would have for when they're siting new facilities or upgrading facilities, or the way that they communicate with communities nearby? Third, we recommended that EPA provide direct federal funding and guidance to the state for the implementation of environmental justice efforts. And then lastly, we recommended that the state agency adopt an environmental justice policy that requires environmental equity in its practices. So we wanted them to acknowledge the problem, develop at least some kind of internal mechanism to address environmental justice in permitting, in notice, somewhere that could be useful for the communities that are affected and for legal advocates. And you're looking at a picture of me on the left presenting the report, and on the bottom is it's a small picture, but Makara, who's the environmental justice attorney at Greenlaw now. I presented the report to citizens in hotspot communities, to activists, and I met with a representative from the state environmental agency and a contact at EPA, and we've spread it out as much as we could, again, to kind of get the conversation going. I placed a few of the news headlines from the week that the report was released. And you can see that the responses varied from simply stating that the report identified socioeconomic disparities. So on the left side, study Metro Atlanta's poor minorities live near worse pollution. It's just kind of a general statement, to drawing targeted attention to specific environmental justice hotspot communities. There's pollution report calls out Canton city leaders skeptical of firm's findings, identifying Douglas County as being within one of the hotspots. So the headline on the top right, city leaders skeptical of firm's findings, kind of leads me to the next slide, where I'm going to briefly discuss some of the criticisms in the report. First, we generally, though not always, receive negative responses from leaders and communities identified as environmental justice hotspots. We got feedback that they felt that the label was unfair and reflected negatively on the community overall. So how do you balance this idea of identifying environmental justice hotspots for your own work without creating a negative stigma around that community? For example, the leader in Canton, our #2 hotspot, felt that we had unfairly highlighted them as an environmental justice community when they had only one pollution source in the identified block. That also played a part in kind of the criticism of the methodology. Some people, in addition to the leaders in Canton, criticized our use of violations as a pollution point of equal value to traditional pollution sources, like NPDES permit sites or TRI sites. They felt that it skewed the results unfairly. And all I can say again is that we felt it was necessary to include violations in our analysis, and we considered only those violations that we felt were substantial. And there wasn't as much feedback on the fact that we created an equal value for different types of pollution, which I was a little bit surprised by, and that was something that Nick and I went back and forth about. And it was just too difficult to create a value for different types of pollution sources. And then lastly, we did get some criticism about the lack of health effects data on identified environmental justice communities. We made a conscious decision not to include public health data in the study. We were really just looking at identifying where the environmental justice communities are, as opposed to doing a full risk assessment and stating that these communities, were being affected in a certain way. But that was the obvious next question. Once you've identified the areas, people want to know, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm at risk for certain diseases, for cancer, et cetera? And I just always say in response that that's a great question, and we think that we've identified certain areas that should be studied further. And I'd like to end on a positive note. So I'll say that we did in fact accomplish many of the goals of our study. As I said, we did receive a strong response from the media. It was positive again because it drew attention to environmental justice problems in the region. The report also served as a vehicle for public engagement, giving me a tool to make presentations to a diverse array of citizens that might not otherwise be interested in hearing about environmental issues. And again, it could be tailored to a specific audience. The #3 hotspot that I pointed out was an area where I went and gave a talk to after the report came out, and it was the audience was a group of Asian American journalists and local leaders, and they said they were unaware of the pollution sites, that were right in their neighborhoods, and that they were surprised by what we had revealed in our findings, and they wanted to know more about how they could get involved in environmental justice and why it is that the state didn't have that kind of policy. So it was useful in engaging communities in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. Also, Fulton County's government, which is Fulton County is houses the city of Atlanta, or at least most of it, and it's I think the second most populated county in the state. And it had the most environmental justice hotspots in our study, including the #1 hotspot. Just a couple months after we issued the report, they passed an environmental justice resolution. The report was released in March 2012, and the resolution came out in May 2012. And the report used our study's findings to pass an environmental justice resolution that asked that the state adopt an environmental justice policy or law. So, I mean, to me, that's a pretty big reaction to the study, because this is, you know, a government body which houses the biggest city in the Southeast, saying to the state government, why don't we have an environmental justice policy or law? We've at least have one study here that shows that this is an issue that maybe we should be considering when we're allowing new sites to come into the area. And a sample of the language that was used in that resolution, it's got a little legal verbiage to it, but now therefore be it resolved that the Board of Commissioners of Fulton County hereby concurs with the recommendation of the Green Law Report and urges EPD to take swift action to develop, implement, and enforce regulations and policies to promote environmental justice for the citizens of Fulton County and the entire state of Georgia. So they relied on the report's results to make the argument that this is an issue, a problem, and then followed through with our recommendations. So we were pleased about that. And they also formulated an environmental justice working group, and in the resolution that created the report, they relied on our statistics as well. And then lastly, it was a tool for engagement with decision makers. As I said, it allowed us to tailor arguments to local policy leaders and say, perhaps environmental justice should be brought into the conversation when we're doing land use in your city or county, or would you be supportive of a statewide or regional environmental justice policy? So that's still being done by the environmental justice attorney at Greenlaw. Hopefully we'll see more results. But that is all I have, and I look forward to hearing your questions.